So as you can see, my fishing net needs a wee bit of work here. We often think of, and if we think about the early settlers in the colonial Americas or in the upper Canadas, the French Canadian settlements, New France, as their primary source of protein being big game, wild meat, etc. When the opposite's true. I mean, it was nice to have, but it wasn't predictable. What was predictable was fishing. So a fellow named John Cabot, he arrives in Newfoundland in 1497. Only, let's see, 5 years after, 5 years? Yeah, 5 years after Columbus arrives in the Indies, West Indies. And he sees such a massive amount of fish in the waters off the Grand Banks. In fact, in his diaries, he said all one had to do was put a weighted basket, drop it over the ship, lower it down a little bit, and pull up a basket full of fish. And it literally was like that. So essentially, fish fed the nation, totally. Everyone fished. And if you think about the colonies, they all settled along the Atlantic Ocean and all the rivers and tributaries flowing into it. So they had oysters, they had mussels, they had freshwater fish, they had the saltwater fish. And yeah, basically it fed both the Canadas and the colonies. Anyway, this old fishing net needs a lot of work. It's got cork floats, so to be more historically accurate for my time period, I'm going to redo this whole thing, and I'm going to actually make some wooden floats for it, which would have been probably much more normal than this, and I'm going to retie all the netting. The lead weights you see, same, we use a mold the same as you would for running balls, it was called, and that would be for making our lead balls for shooting. So I've got a little trekking ladle here I carry. So we melt the lead in that, we pour it into a mold, and we make these weights. They also use stone if they didn't have the lead available. So yeah, I got a lot of work to do here. First thing is trying to straighten it all out, and then I'm going to start tying the net. Anyway, that kind of brings me to salt. And I've got a little salt box I made here. And again, this isn't an antique, but it's taken from measurements from an antique piece that would be circa 1740s or so. And every cabin had a salt box. So we think of salt today as a nice spice on our meal. But back then it was essential, primarily for food preservation, for fish, making sauerkraut, making brines for their pork and beef once they got into husbandry and had the time and the luxury of actually harvesting their own raised animals. So salt was in every cabin. It was quite a commodity and became very scarce during the American Revolution. The colonies relied on England for a lot of things, and salt was one of them. So it ran out. And then there's this fellow, to show how important it was, one of the first American folk heroes, and probably one of their most famous would be this fellow named Daniel Boone. And Daniel Boone crosses, I believe 1775, he goes through the Cumberland Gap into what we now know as Kentucky. And he starts a little community there in a fort called Boonesboro. I think we go forward a few years, I think it's 1778, they're in desperate need of salt, and they need tons of it to get through the winter. So there's salt licks nearby, and Daniel Boone takes a group of the men, and they go off to these salt licks to boil down the salt. Their smoke attracts the Shawnee, and Daniel Boone's captured and adopted into the tribe. It takes him quite a while to escape and get back to Boonesboro. So that shows how important it was. We don't know, there's not a lot of history on the number of men taken or how many actually made it back to Boonesboro, but salt was essential, and life or death in a certain sense. So yeah, so we're going to go into the cabin. I'm going to hang this guy up, see how it looks. Okay, I have one last piece to build, and again I want to build it from an actual piece, so I want to get the measurements and actually build something from the 1700s. So we need a candle box. Every cabin had one. I got to build that. I've got a small cradle I finished for our water barrel. I'm going to bring that in, and this cabin's getting awful close to being done. I'm going to grab that barrel. If you can think about one of the most common things in your modern kitchen today, that's what the barrel was to the people living in the 1718, even into the 1900s, the wooden barrel. In fact, if you were unemployed and you lived in the colonies, you could pretty much guarantee get a job as a cooper or a cooper apprentice making wooden barrels. So this is the smallest they make, and this is going to serve sort of as our water source in the cabin. This one's called a pin, smallest barrel they made. And if you think about what they stored in them, they stored molasses, vinegar, spirits, beer, cider. Then they had barrels that they would ship for shipping their resources back to Europe. They would have barrels for shipping apples, nails, whatever that didn't have to be watertight. So again, this is a pin. I'm going to see if I can get this right, and I'm sure there's going to be some historians out there that are going to correct me, but in terms of the different sizes, the next one was a Fergan, and it was 8 gallons. Then the Kinderkin at 16, the Rundlet at 18, the Barrel at 32, the Terce at 42, a Hogshead at 63 gallons. An interesting thing about the hogshead, there's an old Irish song called Rosin the Bow. And it's a funeral, basically, in the song. And they're saying, send down a hogshead of whiskey. And I can just see a bunch of Irishmen having access to 63 gallons of spirits. Yeah, that'd be quite the weight that happened in there. The puncheon was next at 84. The butt was, I believe, 126. And the ton was 252. Everything was shipped, everything was stored, and they were an essential part of life in the early Americas. And this is going to serve us well for a water tank. Yeah, a little water tank for our tea. I've had probably more comments on the footwear of the 18th century than anything else. So I thought I would address some of them and look at sort of the array of footwear that they would have had available in the 17 and 1800s. So if you were lucky enough and arrived from Europe with a fine pair of boots like such, I mean, these are getting pretty worn. Bottom line, if you headed to the frontier, there wasn't going to be someone to repair them. The boot would wear out, and you had to find an alternative. The alternative was to adopt native footwear, which was the moccasin. So I couldn't make them, but we do make all of our own moccasins. So the pair that I'm wearing would be, they're called pucker toe, and this is called a vamp, and this has some quill work on it. Now the quill work is pretty much pooched on these. One time it was quite beautiful, but countless hours of work to create this moccasin. So they would sew it into the vamp. So as the moccasin bottom wore out, they'd take the vamp off, sew it onto a new bottom. Until at some point, these are getting close to the vamp's gone as well. So that's pucker toe. The next most common would have been center seam. So these are the shoe packs that I wear. I wear these summer, winter. They're not a true winter moccasin, but they're a center seam. But they're called a shoe pack because they have a sole. So I've actually taken 2 layers of buffalo hide, actually makes the sole of these guys. And in between them, I actually stitch a piece of birch bark. So in building our birch bark canoes, we know that they don't leak too much. So I've never seen any documentation or first-person evidence of it, but it just made sense to me. The bark is pretty waterproof. So yeah, I stitch in a piece of bark between the 2 layers. They're pretty rugged. I can put sort of an insole or an incher lining in that. So those would be center seam up the front, shoe packs. These would be a pair of winter moccasins that I make. Again, I think these ones, this particular pair, yeah, they're also a pucker toe. So we got our pucker toe, not fancy, no quill work. If I can get this apart, we've got our pucker toe vamp on the top, and in these I'll either make socks that out of fur, like beaver, muskrat, or simply I'd make an inner moccasin out of an old blanket. So basically 2 layers of wool on the outside, 3 layers of wool on the bottom, and essentially it looks like a center seam moccasin. That gets stuffed inside, pretty warm in the winter, get greased up with bear fat. So Europeans pretty much had to adapt to what was available, and they had hides, they had the skill to make them. So that became pretty much the normal footwear on the frontier. Now, if you were a gentleman, and you would have a pair of shoes like this, and I've yet to get these buckles on, but these are a buckled shoe, and an aristocrat or someone who had some a reasonable amount of money, had done fairly well on the frontier, might eventually get himself a fine pair of shoes like this. I may have to figure out how this buckle works, but it's looking rather complicated. So yeah, I might have to do a little research on that guy, figure out how they go on. But the buckled shoe was used for centuries, and yet if you go back into the Roman times, the Roman soldiers actually wore sort of a sandal type affair that was held on by laces. But laces to literally hold a pair of shoes on your feet, that didn't come along until into the 19th century. So, and well into the 19th century, where they started to make, these are a pair of brogans. Now, if the time they were made, there was no right or left foot. They were just a shoe, and you put them on and you fumbled around and got blisters until they sort of formed to your foot. But very common footwear in the Civil War, and from then on, shoelaces became the norm for both men and women's footwear. Anyway, hopefully that addresses all the questions I've got about my footwear. And yeah, I've got to, some of these are getting pretty shoddy. My moccasins, I've got to be making a few more, but I've still got some hides to get done. When that's done, I'll be sewing moccasins this winter by the new fireplace. So I often thought I wouldn't get old and stupid in my old age, but I picked the hottest day we've had all summer in Eastern Ontario to fire up my forge and make a new fire poker for the fire. Anyway, we've got Bullwinkle up here for my draft, and I decided I'd do another big game animal. So I did a little ram's head on that. They can keep each other company. And I pretty much finished my last piece of furniture. So every cabin had a candle box. And what I've tried to do in this cabin is try to recreate just the essential things that they would have had or needed, and they didn't go to effort to make things they didn't need, but they all had candle holding boxes. And so this one is, I modeled it off an original piece. So it's circa late 1700s, early 1800s. In that time period, this sort of fishtail scroll was quite popular. Maybe represent oil. They burned a lot of whale oil, fish oils for their Betty lamps and stuff. But so predating lanterns by a long shot, everybody had to have a candle box. So, and I've decided I'm going to hang it right over here, I think. Okay, these historically accurate shoe buckles, they're sort of a complicated little ditty. Anyway, it kind of taxed my brain to figure this out, but I got the one done, and I'm just going to see if I can remember what I did on that one and get my other shoe done. So the first thing I got to do is get it centered on the shoe. So, if memory serves, I'm going to go down through this part. Oh, something wrong already. I think we got to flip this guy around this way. Then come up through this part. Clumsy as a bear with boxing gloves on here. Okay, so that's going to come up through there. And we're going to get that guy centered on the foot. And we're going to mark the underside. Yeah, okay, so I just got to get that marked. Okay, got my marks on there. So now I'm going to my hole in the leather. Okay, now I got to take the shoe off. So next step, I got my holes punched, so I'm going to fix the permanent side here, I hope, to the shoe. Okay, so I have that. I don't think something's wrong here. Nope, that's right. Okay, so I've got, this is really taxing me. I got that part fastened. So the shoe's got to go back on my foot now. Okay, got it centered, got it anchored on that side. So now we have to mark the holes for the actual buckle to fasten the shoe. We're going to do something like that. And we're going to mark this guy like that. Good. Okay, see how close we came here to getting this right. Okay, that worked. Took me almost as long to do that as it did to build this here cabin. Anyway, I'm dressed in my better clothes today because we're off on a holiday. So the clothes I'm wearing are typical, sort of the first 3/4 of the 1700s. About the time of the American Revolution, fashion changes somewhat. And they're not a rich man's clothes. They're the clothing that someone who had done well on the frontier, either in trapping, fur trapping, farming, or some commercial undertaking. But so yeah, because we're going for a visit, my wife and Kathy and we're off to see our kids and our grandkids in Port Dover, Ontario, southwestern Ontario on the north shore of Lake Erie. But we're going to fast forward a bit from the 1750s to about 60 years to the War of 1812. And Port Dover, which at the time of the war was known as Dover Mills, is sort of the focal point of the end of the war and some atrocities that sort of happened there. But when war is declared, President of the United States is a fellow by the name of James Madison. Congress and him decide they're going to declare war on Britain. And it seemed an opportune time to do so because there's a short little fellow named Napoleon over there in Europe giving him a real thumping. So they declare war on Britain and they invade Canada. And there's a quote, I'm not sure Madison made it or someone in Congress said it, but it was, it would be a mere matter of marching. Well, it wasn't so much. In fact, it didn't go so well for the Americans, and it didn't really go that well for us. So 3 years and a bit later, war is over. Nothing really changes. The treaties are signed. The boundaries don't change. The real losers, sadly, and they were the real losers, were the indigenous peoples. So those that sided either as allies with the British or allies to the Americans. Anyway, we're off to finally get to visit our grandchildren. And now I'm going to leap again even further, or further into the future than the War of 1812, and I'm going to drive myself this here thing called an automobile. And I'm going to do this trip in about 4.5 hours. But it wouldn't have been that uncommon for a pioneer to have to make a trip of that same distance. They would have done it either by horseback or, in most cases, in the early 1700s, by foot. Perhaps in new buckled shoes, which were guaranteed to give them some blisters, because I can feel them happening already here until these get broke in. Anyway, we're pretty tickled pink here because we're finally going to get to see our grandkids. We've had this little thing called COVID happening, and it's been about 1.5 years since I gave them a hug. We're off to Dover, or I should say Dover Mills.
Fascinating. This pioneer cemetery literally is full of war heroes. In fact, we've even got a war hero over here on one of the tombstones you'll see was from the French and Indian Wars. So one of the first major wars on this continent started in 1756, ended in 1763. But if one studies history, the next war on the continent was the American Revolution. So all those American colonists fought for Britain in the French and Indian Wars and as loyalists. But you don't have to go too many years forward when the American Revolution starts. But the French and Indian Wars was really the start of the American Revolution. King George II, when it was over, issues a proclamation telling these militia people that fought so desperately and died for Britain in the French and Indian Wars that they couldn't go west of the Appalachian Mountains, that was for the natives peoples. And they thought they were fighting for land. And so that kind of got them a little bit riled up. And so one might say the American Revolution actually started in, the 1860s, early 1860s. So a wee bit of history about the location I'm sitting in. I'm in the modern town of Port Dover, Ontario, on the north shore of Lake Erie. But at the time it was called Dover Mills. Just west of here is a small little port called Port Ryerson. During the War of 1812, the residents of Port Ryerson wake up to a foggy morning. May of that year had been quite foggy on the lake. As the fog lifted, and they're off doing their chores, perhaps milking their cows and what have you, fog lifts, and there are 7 American warships, including the Caledonia and the Lawrence. And they've got small boats off to the sides of them, so the residents know they're landing. So the alarm's given, people run, they know they're going to go to Dover Mills because of all the mills and goods that are supplying the troops in the Niagara Peninsula. And Americans are getting prepared to cross the Niagara River and attack Canada again. So they want to cut off their supply line. So this fellow named John Campbell, Colonel John Campbell, he's got 500 American regulars, and he's got 200 militia that had boarded these ships, come over from Presque Isle Island, and landed at Port Ryerson. So next thing the residents of Port Ryerson see the sails going up, and they start sailing east. They landed just west of here, of Dover Mills, and they go to shore. Now the militia that still existed in the Dover Mills area were a bunch of old men like me. The young fellows had all been gathered up by Bragg a year or two earlier and sent down to the Detroit region, all the small towns around the Long Point area. So they put up a bit of a skirmish, but they obviously couldn't against a small army. The Americans camp, and in the morning they come into Dover Mills, and in a few minutes I'm going to go down and wash my face down here by the actual dam where one of the mills stood. They burnt 3 mills, 3 grist mills, 3 sawmills, 3 distilleries. I guess they liked their whiskey, and all the commercial buildings, or most of the commercial buildings in the town. But then Campbell goes a little bit beyond the call of duty, and he orders his men to burn the entire town. So all the homes. And he graciously allows the women and children to go in and get a handful of possessions, as if he's being some kind of a gentleman. And it was one of the worst military atrocities, certainly of the war, up till that time. And it ultimately led to the British, in retaliation, going down there to a little place called Washington and burning their Parliament buildings. I'm not quite sure what they do. Somebody told me to quickly get their government back up and running. They whitewashed the buildings because they didn't have time to construct and paint. It became known as the White House from that point on. Anyway, a bit of fascinating history, and I tried to put myself in place of heading down to milk my cow in Port Ryerson on the morning of May the 14th, 1814, and seeing, a virtual navy full of all these soldiers just off the shores of my house. Anyway, a wee bit of history of this area. I'm going to go down and wash my face.